Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Gwaltney.
We're glad to be with you this morning, Dr. Magnus and I, in the Word. And we're in the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and we've been following some very interesting characters out of Israel's distant past. And today we have an even more interesting character out of Israel's past from Transjordan.
Across on the east side of the Jordan River.
Jephthah. By name. So he is really going to be an interesting character. And up front, I guess we can say he too made it into Hebrews as a hero of the faith.
Yes, there are 4 judges who are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Somewhat surprisingly, Deborah is not mentioned in that chapter because she was such a great leader. But maybe they were thinking that she mainly played the role of prophet. At any rate, 4 judges, and they are the 4 that we're studying in this series of lessons this month.
That's right. So we got Barak, we got Gideon from last week, and now we have Jephthah, and there'll be one more.
There will be one more, and they're all in Hebrews chapter 11. Yeah. Well, we've seen the pattern develop, and it's certainly true with Jephthah as well, that after a period of peace and stability and obedience, a military threat posed itself in one part of Israel or another, since there are hostile tribes living all around them and in some ways within them as well. And this time it's the Ammonites.
Well, it's very interesting that we do have a geographical progression here too. The first one that we looked at was in the North Country, based around that very far north city of Hazor.
City of the Canaanite people.
Yeah, and then we had, last week we had Gideon, and that would be in the hill country a little bit further south.
In the region of Manasseh, the tribal region of Manasseh.
Right. And the big battle was in the valley of Esdraelon, which is right in the dead center of what we call Israel or Palestine. Now we switch to Transjordan.
So we're moving east.
And we're in what is today the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. And so then next week we'll come back west of the Jordan, but we'll be in the Gaza Strip. And that
over near the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, exactly.
Southern part. Now this word Ammonite should sound familiar to most of our viewers, because that word Ammon is still being used over in that area today.
Only we changed the pronunciation just very slightly. Amman, the capital of the Kingdom of Jordan.
Okay, Amman, Jordan is the same word as Ammon, Ammonites.
Preserves this very, very ancient name, yes.
Yeah. So it's the Ammonites who are the great threat. Now our printed text starts in verse 4, but we meet our next judge, Jephthah, in verse 1 of chapter 11.
That's right.
And we see there that he is called a Gileadite. That was a region of Transjordan, Gilead.
Now that's not one of the tribes of Israel. The tribes of Israel that were in the east were a little bit further to the south, and Reuben and Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh had part on the east and part on the west.
This region of Gilead probably overlaps best with the tribal region of Gad. I think it would
Yeah,
have been roughly in that area.
Right. It's mainly east of the Sea of Galilee and a little bit to the south of it.
Yeah. So we know where Jephthah is from. Verse 1 of chapter 11 also tells us what he was like. He was a warrior. That's just his nature. But
He's a gang boss, is what he
he
is.
becomes a gang boss. Yeah, he had a rough beginning. His birth and his early childhood weren't the best.
Well,
really.
his mother was a prostitute.
And so
and,
his father was not married to his mother. He had a wife and other children.
Yes.
So when Jephthah came along, he was an illegitimate child, son of a prostitute, and was badly mistreated by his siblings, his half-siblings.
There's a very famous character in British history, very similar. William the Conqueror was also known by William the Illegitimate.
Oh, yeah.
So,
But he accomplished a lot, didn't he? And Jephthah is going to accomplish a lot
sometimes
too.
these characters that are mistreated and abused because of no fault of their own. Sometimes that makes some pretty tough characters.
Well, Jephthah was a tough character after being driven out of his father's household by some of his older legitimate brothers. He goes out to the edge of the desert out there in an area called Tob, and
Which, by the way, is very interesting in Hebrew. This word means good.
oh, Tov, yeah. So he goes out to this good place.
Yeah. We don't know exactly where it was.
It was out there in the desert. It may not have been all that good. Kind of reminds me of Eric the Red named Greenland because he wanted lots of settlers to come there and think it was this lush agricultural area.
It's not very
Turns
much
out
green.
it's covered with ice. So at any rate, he goes out to Tov, and so here he is, this rough and ready warrior kind of guy, and he attracts around him what one translation calls a bunch of good-for-nothings. And
in the Hebrew, it's empty.
Empty.
Yeah, you remember when Jesus described those that referred to other people as empty heads?
Fools.
It's the same word.
Okay. So he got some roughneck fools around him, some empty-headed fools around him, and makes his own little desert militia out there.
Well, that's being kind.
Okay, well, I liked a word you used a little earlier, desperados.
Yeah,
or something
desperados.
like that. Banditos or something like that. These guys
Pancho Villa.
living out there, Pancho Villa, living out on the edge of the desert. Well, that's our introduction to Jephthah. Now we come to the printed text.
Now, we've talked in the past about God using people who don't really have much of a chance and who you can't expect will amount to much. And I think we have really found one for sure in Jephthah.
We've either hit bottom or we're close to the bottom. We'll see how Samson compares to Jephthah when we talk about Samson next week.
Next week, yeah.
All right, I'll start reading in chapter 11, verse 4. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." Jephthah answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" The elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Now skipping down to verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.
Yes. Well, in the rest of the story, we can more or less tell. We again have only the upfront part
Just the
of
very
the
beginnings
story,
of the story.
What happened is that, of course, he did go to battle, and he led the troops of Gilead in victory over the Ammonites, and then he came home and.
This vow, this kind of rash vow of sacrificing
Came
whatever
back to
comes
bite
out.
him.
Yeah. So
And
we'll come back to that.
Yes, and
at the end.
later then, after all of this was settled, he had a bit of a war against another tribe of Israel, this time, the Ephraimites.
Who are jealous that they were left
Left
out
out.
of the battle.
Yeah.
Battles in
But they
those,
turned him down. He calls attention to that.
Yeah.
Well, back then you wouldn't help us.
Yeah.
So I had to go on my own with what I had. And now that I've won, now you want to make war on me, and so you asked for it, you're going to get it. And he did, in fact, defeat some army out of the tribe of Ephraim.
right. And then
And then he was judged for, what was it, 6 or 7?
just 6 years.
6 years.
Just so, yeah,
And
Jephthah
that's
is
that's the end of his career.
short time.
Yeah.
Well, there is some irony in the request of the leaders, the elders of Gilead, that Jephthah will come and be their commander, and head, and Jephthah doesn't mind pointing out the irony of this.
Right.
First, they had either participated in or not gotten involved in driving him away from his family, clan, and homeland.
It wasn't enough that they just didn't treat him well. They actually booted him out.
Right.
I mean, he had to go and live by his wits.
Yeah, and he points that out. Weren't you the very ones who hated me because I was a illegitimate child, and aren't you the ones who drove me from my father's house? And so he points out the irony. Now they're coming begging to him to get them out of trouble. Yeah, at first they say, come and be our commander. That would be like Barak was, a military leader,
Yes.
even though he wasn't the political leader. Or say, back in the story of Deborah, it would be like Sisera, even though he wasn't the king. Jabin was the king.
Yeah.
But then when Jephthah balks and says, wait a minute, why would I come be your commander? You're the ones that kicked me out. They up the ante a little bit.
Well, he displays a very strong distrust of them. Yeah, you want me now, but let's say that I do come along and lead you in victory and protect you, and then you'll dump me again, just like you did before.
So they promise more the second time.
Oh,
First
and
they say
no-
commander, second they say head.
And then it's very clear that he made it must have made it a requirement that he be appointed head before he goes to the battle. And that's very clear in the text. The people made him head and commander, both, over them. Then he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Mizpah, by the way, is a lookout tower or fort on high ground.
Yeah. So Jephthah has, as you said, been forced to live by his own wits, and he's a tough bargainer when it comes
He's
to
smart.
to
He's
this.
street smart,
Yeah.
as the whole story is.
Yeah. Now, in the part of the text that's left out, verses 12 through 28 from our printed text, we see Jephthah the negotiator and Jephthah the warrior, because at first he tries to negotiate with the king of Ammon.
You think that a guy like this does not know anything about Israelite history. You would expect, because he got kicked out of the family, that he wouldn't be raised in the tradition. And you would think that, well, he is a warrior. He's a dumb warrior. You know, he's not intellectual whatsoever. But that's not the picture we get of him.
Right.
He knows Israelite history.
Yeah, and so in those missing verses, we see here in the middle part of chapter 11, he rehearses the whole history of Israel's arrival in Transjordan.
And what happened en route.
And we're talking back during the time of Moses' leadership, during the wilderness journey,
Yes.
and their arrival up in Transjordan just before they crossed over into Canaan. And he knows the history perfectly.
And he's pointing out that Israel showed respect for the territory of Edom, for the territory of Moab, and for the territory of Ammon.
Right.
And they asked permission to come through those territories. They were denied. And instead of making war on these people, they went out into the desert outside of the territory of those three areas, and then made their way north.
Right. And even then, they very carefully came in toward the Jordan River between Moab to the south and Ammon to the north.
Yes.
And didn't, trample their crops or invade their cities or their
That's
settlements.
probably why they crossed the Jordan where they did. Because that was there was a path to the river between those two. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, eventually, his attempts at negotiation and diplomacy with the king of the Ammonites falls on deaf ears, and so he resorts to his military side and attacks them and defeats them.
Yeah. Yes.
But the second part of our printed text, which describes the beginning of that military campaign, also has the most famous part of the story of Jephthah is this rash vow that he makes before he goes into battle.
Now, this is where his being kicked out of the family comes back to afflict him. Because the religions of Chemosh and Molech, the chief gods of the Ammonites and the Moabites, were gods that appear to have required human sacrifice at one time or another. And we do have one famous story recounted in regard to Mesha, king of Moab. And by the way, we actually have a monument of Mesha, king of Moab, the black stone, Moabite stone, which is in the Louvre, unless they have it lent out someplace. And it tells the story of the war between Moab and Judah and Israel. And Yahweh, I mean, it even talks about the followers of Yahweh. And Chemosh is greater than Yahweh on the Mesha stone. So here is the situation. Then he's lived among people whose religion endorses human sacrifice.
Now, you were talking about Mesha, the king of Moab.
Yes.
He actually, we know that he participated in child sacrifice,
yes,
right?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
That's recorded in the Bible, in Old Testament, in that the battle for his city was going bad for him, so he sacrificed a son on the wall of the city in the presence for all to see and for the God to see. And he did, in fact, survive the battle, and he was saved. So there's a classic example of it, and we have other examples of it as well, scattered through the books, mainly of Samuel and Kings
Okay.
in the Old Testament.
And I think the Canaanites at sometimes used child sacrifice as well. didn't
Yeah, in fact, the valley of Topheth, the sons of Hinnom, which was called a Tophet, which is a word for oven, and apparently maybe had been a place where human sacrifice or child sacrifice had been practiced. So here, now we've got to talk about what happened.
Right.
You
Well,
know, but what I'm saying is he's lived in an area where child sacrifice was a known practice of these pagan religions. And that's what he obviously was aware of that.
So it was kind of the norm of the pagan societies in which he lived.
Yes.
Child sacrifice was
That
widely
is
accepted.
background to
Right.
the narrative.
Yeah.
Now let's go on and take this few verses of kind of get into them and see what we've got.
Well, after the military victory, which God directs Jephthah in winning, he's very successful. He's raised this army of some of the tribes in that area.
Well, on the eve of the big battle, he knows that he again is probably not. He doesn't have a big enough army. Probably, let's leave it this way: that the outcome of the battle is in some jeopardy for him.
Yeah.
So he's got to do everything in his power, take every action he can in order to be sure he wins.
So even though he knew about the history of his people, the Israelites, he really doesn't understand God very well, because
Right.
God doesn't usually doesn't need bribes like this. God, I'll do this if you give me the victory. That's
Well,
not
long before this time, God had more or less turned down the whole practice, turned against the whole practice in the story of Abraham and Isaac. And so, but he didn't seem to understand this.
yeah.
So he says,
Yeah, the wording is in verse 30. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, now verse 31, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.
yes,
Now, let's check the wording there. First of all, the last phrase, burnt offering, I think is more literally whole.
it's
Offering,
that
right?
which goes up. And it is a normal term for a burnt
A
offering.
whole burnt offering, okay.
That is, now part of it can be waived. There are wave offerings in connection with it too. And what this means is that part of the offering is going to be burned on the altar,
Okay.
but part of it is going to be held above the altar and waved back and forth and not put on the altar, but be given to the priest.
Okay, so
And
not burned up, but be given
So
to the
that
priest.
was the wave offering, and,
Yeah.
and the olah, as it's known in Hebrew, that which goes up.
Okay.
So it
Now
is.
the other word that's key here is the first word in verse 31, whatever, because that's sometimes translated whoever, right?
Yes, and in the grammar of the situation, it is an active participle, which in Hebrew means it is the one who
person.
comes. It is usually of people.
Yeah. The reason we raise this question is trying to figure out what Jephthah anticipated actually coming out of the house when he made this vow.
Yeah.
And does he expect his daughter to come out? Does he expect some other human being? Or is it
A dog.
a dog or
Or
a
a cat
lamb
or
a
whatever.
Yeah. And
Well, in the first place, I don't think animals would be inside the house to come through the door.
so it's very possible that he anticipates that a human being will be coming out. And if so, it sounds like he's prepared to participate in this human sacrifice.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, later on, of course, after the victory, his daughter turns out to be the one who comes out first. When she sees him approaching, she comes out celebrating his victory with dancing and music.
Now, before we turn the cameras on, you asked me a very interesting, provocative question. If he really was saying the first person who comes out to meet me through the door when on my return, who did he expect that to be? And I think is a very good question, and I think he would expect some servant of the house to be the one who would come out to meet him first.
Which now, in some ways isn't much of an excuse, because he would have still been prepared to perform human sacrifice.
Yeah.
But you think it's not likely that he thought his daughter would be meeting.
I think he thought, if this is, we're trying to put ourselves into the man's mind, and that's a very dangerous thing to try to do. But if he was expecting this to be a human being, he would think that it would be probably some young servant.
The other thing we don't know for sure is how this was actually fulfilled. It says that his daughter went out for 2 months and mourned her virginity, that she would die a virgin. At the end of that, it says that Jephthah fulfilled his vow.
It doesn't ever say he made a sacrifice of her.
Right.
But it does say he performed his vow.
Yeah, so we're left with the ambiguity. Did he actually put her to death in fulfillment of this vow as a sacrifice to God, which would fit the pagan pattern of the people who lived around him? Or did he give her to the Lord, not kill her, but devote her to the Lord in a way that she would not be able to marry and bear children for the rest of her life? Was that what he did?
Yeah, and of course, a whole lot of people get involved in this thinking in terms of medieval concepts of giving women to the Lord by putting them in a nunnery, and they are the bride of the Lord instead of a human being.
Yeah.
And of course, there was nothing like that in the religions on either side of the Jordan, as far as we can tell.
So, and there's no temple for her to go and serve at anyway.
Well, there probably were some.
There were some sites, but
yeah. But in other words, there are arguments on both sides of the issue.
So we just don't know,
and we're left in the dark.
We just don't know. Here is one thing I'll mention. There's a famous church, St. Catherine's, on the slopes of Mount Sinai. And up by the altar where they celebrate the saving death of Jesus are 2 paintings, one of Abraham and Isaac and one of Jephthah and his daughter. So early Christians took this story as a parallel to Abraham and Isaac and the near sacrifice.
And of course, the outcome there was that the ram was substituted for
and
the
Isaac
son.
was not killed. But they used them both as a reminder of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ.
Both of them are in advanced expectations of Christ. Yes.
Kind of interesting.
Well, we're going to leave that whole question up in the air. We don't know the answer to it, but we will come back next week to look at another character of dubious quality in Samson, and that'll be the end of our study of the Judges, at least for our purposes in this Sunday School series. But that's a very interesting story too, as you well know. So come back and be with us, and may God be with you through the week and with your loved ones.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministry.